Do you like books? I mean, really, really like books? Then you're in the right place. Each week, your host, Sam Hankin, interviews the best of today's top-selling authors and the up-and-coming superstars of modern literature. This is The Avid Reader. Here is your host, Sam Hankin.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Avid Reader, brought to you by Wellington Square Bookshop. Our guest today is F.H. Buckley, author of Progressive Conservatism: How Republicans Will Become America's Natural Governing Party, released just a couple of days ago by Encounter Books. Frank Buckley is a professor at George Mason University School of Law, where he has been that since 1989. The many books he has authored touch on constitutional government, the rule of law, contract theory, and most enjoyably, laughter. Hopefully he will enjoy, as I guess few do, my attempts at humor in this conversation. He's a frequent contributor to American Spectator, as well as the Wall Street Journal. He's appeared frequently on NPR. Actually, I just watched him last week talking about this book, which was excellent, and Fox News. Some of his most recent and incredibly relevant books include American Succession, the Republican Workers' Party, and The Way Back, all published during the Trump presidency. Speaking of which, Mr. Buckley and his wife were instrumental in establishing the framework for the Trump presidency's worldview early on in a speech they co-authored for Mr. Trump's major foreign policy speech at the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee convention, just a few months before the 2016 presidential election. And then he co-authored Donald Trump Jr.'s speech at the 2016 Republican National Convention. And during his tenure at Mason, he's also, just to know, lectured and served as visiting fellow twice at the Sorbonne. So, progressive conservatism, what is it? To explicate his thesis, Frank harkens back to what he considered the halcyon days of the Republican Party, starting with the sacred text, as he states, and I agree, of the Federalist Papers, James Madison, and taking us forward to three Republican stalwarts, Lincoln, TR, and Dwight Eisenhower. The message that Mr. Buckley wishes us to apprehend, at least in my view, is that our constitutional freedoms must be maintained, that we can once again be held up as a beacon of democracy to the rest of the world, as once we were, and that it's not too late to navigate between the Scylla and Charybdis of fawning liberalism and alt-right delusion, as well as, mixing my metaphors, to quell the rising tide of cynicism and disgust that Americans now feel for politics in general and their elected officials in specific. So welcome, Frank, and thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So in your book, as an excellent gloss over current issue and theory, you guide us by reminding us that the Republican Party essentially sits on the shoulders of giants, Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and especially Eisenhower. So in doing so, and I'll try not, this is not baiting you. In doing so, you shepherd us along by invoking the name of historical figures who helped define where we were and where we might be going, from Robespierre, Gladstone, Wilson, Taft, Coolidge, even the Whig Party. And this is so helpful to a reader who is trying to grasp the thread of an argument in the context of the history of not only our country, but of the East, of Europe. So one question now, knowing the Donald as you do you believe that he would be familiar with even one of the names that I just listed?
Oh, probably all of them, but
no way.
Yeah, right. But, let's get this out of the way. Trump embarrassed himself and the country greatly on January 6th. His time is over. I supported him in 2016. I even supported him in 2020. I voted for him. But his administration, even before January 6th, was a great disappointment. I don't think he figured out what it was all about, other than thinking it was all about himself. So the Republican Party will be doomed if he got the nomination again. It really would be horrible. He'd lose everybody. I think the trick, though, is trying to identify that which attracted people in 2016, which was noble, as opposed to the man himself. So Trumpism circa 2016 minus Trump is what I'm suggesting. And in fact, I'm relating it to American history. progressive conservatism will sound odd to people, but I think if it does, that's because they have an imperfect understanding of progressivism, conservatism, the GOP, and even of America. Now, I'm from the West. I'm a Westerner. And I think what I'd like to do is ask people to try to recast American history, not in terms of North versus South, but East versus West. And the people that go ahead.
I was going to say, just to get the reader's understanding correct, when you say West and East, explain to them what you actually mean.
Well, what I'm referring to is an American historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, and his frontier thesis. By the West, I'm talking about more a state of mind than anything. I'm talking about the West as it was understood in 1890 by Turner. And what that meant to him was aristocracy in the East versus democracy and equality in the West, and corruption in the East versus Republican virtue in the West, and nationalism in the West versus cosmopolitanism in the East. So, and all the people I describe, I mean, the people I like here, Lincoln, Eisenhower, and even that damn cowboy, Teddy Roosevelt, were essentially Western figures. They understood it.
Okay, well, I recognize, and you did emphasize this in your NPR talk, where there were some interesting, sometimes lengthy phone calls from various viewers that had to be cut off.
They were gentle. They were gentle.
Relatively speaking, except the one who said you weren't a doer, but you agreed.
I was on a talk show. He said, you're a talker, not a doer. I'm on a talk show.
Exactly. All right, so now what I'm going to do now is no different than what Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, or Bill O'Reilly would do to me. So I don't feel that bad about it. The average adult has a vocabulary of around 40,000 words. I would imagine that Trump's is about 6,000 to 8,000. Studies of his speech and speech pattern have yielded a rather clinical diagnosis that Trump speaks on an 8 to 12-year-old level. A person who uses the word bigly, who can't pronounce Yosemite, who wants to suggest injecting Lysol to quell the Asian flu, who says he's a very stable genius and really smart. Now, you knew all this before. I know you say January 2016, you've said it many times, but you and your wife are very intelligent people. He is not. And you knew all this from watching his career, let alone the beginning of his campaign. I'm not attempting to condemn you for this. I'm just saying you did know it. You actually did know it. And that's where your apology becomes somewhat, I don't know, disingenuous. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying, and it's not an unfair comment. I never met Trump. I met his kids. I like Jared a lot. I thought Jared did great things in getting a Mideast peace deal going. I knew Don Jr. I actually got involved in the campaign by way of Jeff Sessions, who I think was a pretty noble guy.
Yeah,
is a pretty noble guy. So Trump's personality was the sort of thing one had to avert one's gaze from what I knew. What I knew was basically what I read in the New York Times and the like. He was an imperfect messenger for, let us say, Republican virtue. But was it possible, one asked oneself, for him to change the direction of American politics in a good way? And I thought the answer was yes. And I thought the key to that was he understood, I think, what was broken in the Republican Party, which was 60 years of right-wing reaction, beginning with Barry Goldwater and National Review, as opposed to, the Eisenhower republicanism that I liked. And I'm afraid I date myself. I go back to coonskin caps and the like, all of that stuff. That was a great period, and I'd like to see it returned. I wouldn't want to see it returned with Trump. I would have preferred a better candidate morally than Trump. But in the Republican debates in 2016, you had 17 people and 16 of them were basically, your basic right-wing conservative, and one person was what I would have described as a progressive conservative. And what he recognized, and what the campaign recognized early on, is this is going to be a departure from Republican right-wing politics. Very early on, like March 2016, I had dinner with a Koch VP who said, "Well, I sort of like Trump, but what about entitlements?" And I thought, you idiot. Yes, you're right. We're all in favor of entitlements here on our side. We think the federal government has a role to play in protecting the poorest of Americans. We don't think you've been doing that. We don't think the Democrats do it either, right? We thought only one person has a chance of doing it, and that's why we supported him.
And this is where you and I, even though I shouldn't agree with you on a lot of things, just based on the way I've been brought up and the way I perceived the ideologies of both the Republican and Democratic parties. But for example, and because I want to get back to something we don't agree on, Hunter Biden, he's a despicable person. He's a drug addict. He's an alcoholic. He had a relationship with his dead brother's wife. He worked for Burisma, which he had no skill in doing. Perhaps it was corrupt. His father said he knew nothing of it. Obviously, his father knew of it. And now he's painting for $175,000. He has no talent in painting. I agree with all that. I'm not going to apologize for him as a Democrat, but Jared Kushner and Ivanka made hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars getting visas for Chinese rich people. You can disagree with me, as Tucker Carlson would, but in my opinion, based on, look how I'm talking about Hunter, look how I'm talking about Jared. We can engage in civil discourse. We can disagree about Russian collusion. Mm-hmm. You think you're right. I think I'm right. So where does that put us? How do we move forward from that?
Yeah, well, you are telling me something I did not know about Jared. I confess I haven't followed all of that closely. Okay. I turned my mind off after the election. I don't want to hear any more about the family, right? So I didn't pay attention to that. But to the extent, if assuming what you say is true, which I do, yes, that's a problem. And and that brings up something that I mentioned a moment ago, which is the idea that I think there's a great hunger amongst Americans for a party that's going to seek a middle way, but also a party that makes you feel good about America, because we've been told that it's in the trash can, right? On the left, there are a great number of spokespeople who seem to despise America. And on the right, there are people whom you mentioned who've made us look despicable, including Trump. So, where do you go from that? What you want to do is recover, which is why I get nostalgic about this, the way we felt about America in the past, and those great figures up to Eisenhower. So, I guess as well, I'm talking about a difference in how you see American politics. Politics circa 1776 was about Republican virtue. It was about George Washington. It was about people who thought that the key to politics is disinterested virtue, looking for something greater than yourself. As opposed to that, the Democratic Party became rather Madisonian and adopted something called pluralism. And pluralism was the idea that we're all basically nasty people. There's no such thing as disinterested virtue. It's a matter of everybody bargaining at the table. And if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right? So the Democratic Party became a coalition party. And that all broke up, right? So pluralism is self-destructed because we've realized that it treated African Americans terribly, right? And then they were replaced by deplorables for some people. So pluralism doesn't work. The only thing that remains is a rediscovery, I think, of the idea of Republican virtue of the framers, of the founders in 1776, which means that when you see corruption, you should flee from it as if it were the plague. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, other areas in which we agree, which I'm using as a foil for the areas we don't agree, the 1619 Project is silly and stupid and poorly founded. Critical race theory, you and I would have some differences on, because I think it's important to study our history. You're thinking it's overemphasizing, well, like the 1619 Project, that the American Revolution was caused by a desire for slavery. How silly. The Don't Say Gay bill, which doesn't say don't say gay. I do not want a teacher inculcating my child with regard to anything associated with sex, let alone. Those are simple concepts. That the Me Too movement, the overemphasis on trans, the 68 or 78 genders that now exist. It's absurd. Canceling culture, poor J.K. Rowling's, Dave Chappelle, all that. But at the same time, and you said this in your talk last week, and this is where I want to paint you into a corner. You said that abortion, maybe the cutoff should be 16 weeks. You weren't totally unequivocal about that. But here you have, and you also not dismissed Scalia, but did not, you said he was an eminent jurist. That was where you stopped. Yes, and your school and all that stuff. But, and you also said you weren't writing about the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court is covalent with each of the other two institutions that form the tripod of our republic. So you have 6 Republicans, whether you deny it or not, you have 6 Republicans who have overturned a precedent set for 40 to 40 years. And you also have, in the same week, them weakening, prostituting the Second Amendment, decreasing the separation of church and state. And you can say the coach, they didn't have to pray, but they pretty much had to pray. And this is where issues come along. And the last one was saying they just threw in for fun. Let's not worry about climate change. That's in 1 week.
Yeah, well, okay, you've thrown a lot at me.
Well, there's four decisions. 4 decisions in 1 week.
All right. Well, no, my turn.
Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
All right. On the 1619 Project, I will surprise you by saying I wasn't exactly shocked by it. Remember that I emigrated to this country from Canada, and the 1619 Project is basically the Canadian story of the American Revolution, right? Indeed, when I went to the African American Museum on the Mall, and I wrote about this in the New York Post, I was pleasantly surprised. I thought, they've really got it right. They weren't, as extreme as the 1619 Project, but they were talking about things that people tend to forget. I thought that was good. I think it's a better museum than the American History Museum.
Really?
Okay. Yeah. It's more intelligently designed, and it's really informative, and it's done very intelligently. On the Supreme Court, what I believe as to the abortion decision, there's just so much going on here, is that it brings, I think, a level of moral seriousness to the debate. So what is not morally serious are people who are proud of having abortions, who think that it's not a moral issue. It's a moral issue. And I think most Americans would like to see something like, an immigration restriction, which was a kind contemplated in Roe v. Wade initially, which, first trimester, whatever. For a long time, what the right has said about our abortion laws, or the absence thereof, is, gosh, look at Europe, right? There it's decided politically. And you reach a compromise when you do things politically. So the effect of the decision was to turn it over to politics at the state level. And when that happens, what you'll get are people like my governor in Virginia, Governor Youngkin, saying, well, I'd like to have a ban for the first 16 or 20 weeks, right?
Yep.
Which would parallel what they do in Europe. So I think it's useful to inject that kind of moral seriousness to the debate, firstly, and secondly, to get people trying to reach a compromise around the middle. So that's not a bad thing. What we didn't have with Roe v. Wade was something which tended to produce that kind of political compromise where people talk to each other. I think that'd be useful.
Well, let's go further back to Griswold. And the question I would ask you then, and whether this is part of your agenda, do you think there's a penumbra right within the Constitution that's not stated exactly to a right of privacy for individuals within the four walls of their home, whether it's sex or whether it's anything else?
Yeah, I'm not someone who would go around lightly reversing those other decisions, and I don't think the Supreme Court is about to do it. You know that, well, yes, okay. I grant you that. You know, the person I liked in all of this, you might appreciate, was Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton said, as to gay rights, don't ask, don't tell. I think that's great. You know, there's too much information, right? I don't want to know about other people's preferences. I couldn't care less, basically, and I'm bored by it.
Likewise.
Yeah.
But how does this lead to progressive?
Don't ask, don't tell is exactly the wrong thing for Americans. We want to tell you. I want to tell you everything about me, you know, and if you don't want to listen, there's something wrong with you.
Well, that's what Twitter has done. And that's what's happened to civil discourse.
Yeah.
I guess what you and I, kind of admiring ourselves, is we're able to have this conversation. This conversation is not a typical conversation between the left and the right. Yeah. We're talking over each other. We're not listening to what the other person says. There's an argument about abortion. If it's used as a form of birth control, of course not. Of course, I do not advocate that.
Right. Yeah.
But the question is, this
nobody's going to touch that. But let me object to something. You called me or implied that I was a right winger. In my book, right wing is a term of opprobrium. Right wing is what happened after Eisenhower. Right wing was Goldwater right. It was National Review. That's exactly what Eisenhower was not. He said, I'm a progressive, and the Republican Party will go nowhere unless it's progressive. So what I came out in favor of was, you know, a mobility agenda. I think, like Lincoln, that there are things that the government, the federal government, should be doing to promote mobility, and we are an aristocratic society. We are a class society. When I moved here from Canada, I discovered this country seemed to me much less democratic and much less egalitarian than Canada, and the numbers bear me out. So what would you want to have if you wanted an egalitarian society? You would look at the countries which are much more egalitarian, mobile than we are, places like Denmark and Canada, and what would the difference be? Well, some of the differences would be attractive to people on the left, like universal Medicare. Right? Early on, by the way, I told someone, I guess Jared, that Canadian Medicare is a lot better than people say down here, but we can do better. And that line was repeated by Trump the next day. I mean, he had the instincts in the campaign to be a progressive. They just fell apart right away afterwards. He didn't know how to cut deals or push things, or didn't care. Yeah, go ahead. It would also include, a progressive agenda would also include cheap university education. And I support bankruptcy reform, which would wipe out student debt.
That's excellent. And I'm not praising you. I agree with you.
Yeah.
But if you go back to Eisenhower, yes, beware of the military industrial complex, which you actually mentioned in the book. Which again, one more dig. I don't think that Trump knows what the military industrial complex is. That's it. Sorry. But he also, and Biden might do the same thing. Well, he's doing the same thing in Saudi Arabia today with regard to Khashoggi.
Yeah.
He also let Joe McCarthy run rampant over the rights of innocent American citizens. Politically, that may have been
not quite. Eisenhower was a, frankly, somewhat Machiavellian fellow. He had great instincts on civil rights. This was a time when people like Jackie Robinson were Republicans. He had good instincts on economic policies. With respect to Joe McCarthy, he refused to take on McCarthy early on when McCarthy went after George Marshall. Prudently, he said nothing. Quietly, under the radar screen, he did whatever he could to torpedo McCarthy. And indeed, when McCarthy was censured over the Army McCarthy hearings, it was over information released by the Eisenhower administration. So Eisenhower went out of his way to signal he disagreed with McCarthy. He kind of pussyfooted around, to use a TR term, with respect to attacking McCarthy directly. I'll grant you that, but he was instrumental in taking down McCarthy in the end, under the radar screen.
Wow. Edward R. Murrow helped, and have decent last.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll leave that be. I guess I own a bookstore. We're trying to sell your book, so I should actually get back to the book so that you can help that. One of the things you suggest, and again, not outright say it, is that a part of what can happen, and you say that just like Elon Musk just said, that Trump just walk away into the sunset, is that somebody else might be able to take your torch with regard to this book. And you mentioned your own governor, Glenn Youngkin. So give him some support if you can, if you're interested in doing so.
Yeah, well, I'm not very involved in retail politics, but yeah, at least even the Washington Post has recognized this guy is serious and he's not a baddie. That's good. I mean, what Youngkin did was he showed how you could attract Trump voters while holding the man at the end of a 10-foot barge pole. That's what you need to do.
Yeah, he did that. He did do that, but then he has to do certain things that I find anathema, you might find inappropriate, with regard to his own assistant arguing that the election was illegitimate and conspiracy theories while he stepped away from that position, but it helps him politically. But we're just talking about politics, and you're not a politician.
Yeah, I'm not a politician. I think it's extraordinarily important to recognize that Biden won the election fair and square. It's nothing is ever done fair and square completely, but if anybody won, Biden won. And it's a very, very important for Republicans to understand that.
Well, right? Some of the callers, that one Republican caller who's, again, suggested that you were a know-nothing and that Trump beat all these candidates and is obviously the best course for America and the never Trumpers and all that stuff. So instead of that person, and instead of me in some situations, what is your plan for how this can possibly happen when, look, you wrote a book about secession. You just wrote a book about secession and why there you go.
Well, it was against secession, and as was noted, I am a talker and not a doer. Look, I've been an American citizen only from 2014, and so I've not gotten my hands dirty from politics. I'm an ivory tower academic, basically. Harmless. Write books, and the secession book was anti-secession.
Understood.
Yeah.
Well, but then again, with regard to your career, when I said at the outset that the book was published by Encounter and you work at a very conservative university named after a very conservative justice, you could have easily gotten this book published by Columbia University Press or Yale University Press. Why do you choose then
Encounter?
Yeah,
it's very simple. I know Roger Kimball, the publisher of Encounter books. What happened to me was very early on in 2013, I sent him a manuscript of a book on the superiority of parliamentary systems over the American presidential system. I wanted his comments on it. I just sent stuff out, would you give me your comments? And he got back the next day and he said, I'll publish it. Oh, okay. Well, that makes life simpler. So ever since then, I've simply sent books his way. Now, I don't think he much agrees with this one. I recall very early on, I said that the Trump agenda would point the way towards a national health system, and he completely disagreed with me. He's a right-winger, and I'm not. But he's been publishing my books, and they They have a variety of authors writing for them. I am perhaps not in the mold. And as for Scalia, most of my colleagues are libertarian. You're right. It's a right of center institution in terms of the faculty, but they were libertarian and never Trumpers, and I was pro-Trump, so I was very much on the outside of that one. And
yeah, that's true.
So it's sorry.
No, I was just going to say, in retrospect, do you feel that you made a mistake being a Trumper? Would you call it a mistake? Do you regret it?
I don't regret 2016. I guess I regret 2020 voting for him. I had the opportunity to finally meet him in 2019, but at that point I was so teed off at the fellow that I decided I didn't want to meet him. I realized very early on this was not working out terribly well. It wasn't working out because for the first 2 years he had a right-wing Congress which didn't want to do anything that looked vaguely progressive. And then you had the madness of the next 2 years, excuse me, we will disagree, but the paranoia of the Russian collusion story. So but he also wasn't a competent administrator. I mean, his appointments weren't great for the most part. If he had people who were, reasonable, he couldn't get them to agree with him. So the good people left. The bad people stayed, and he surrounded himself with some really objectionable people. I mean, sycophants and sleazoids, that maybe revealed who the man was. So early on, in the middle of all of it up, I threw up my hands.
Well, we're talking at a very opportune time because the January 6th committee is now meeting, and we can talk about Liz Cheney. Is she a progressive?
Yeah, no, she's a right winger. There's there's only one attitude one can have about January 6th. It was terrible. And if you think it was okay, there's something really, really wrong about you. But there are plenty such people. I was on another talk show with a right-wing host, by the way, where I said Trump has to go, and I was called a Judas by him. So there are those crazies out there. I don't care about them.
Yeah, we'll probably both get comments about how we're hypocrites.
Yeah, well, that's okay. I can live with that.
I don't mind it either. But then again, we're both certain about some things. Like, you're certain that there wasn't any Russian collusion. I'm certain that there was. Most Democrats do express, for some reason, no opinion about Hunter Biden. I know exactly who he is. We're both certain about things, and that's difficult.
No, I don't think we're certain about things. I think what one does is one looks at all of the evidence and draws conclusions. And apropos of Russian collusion, you're right, I wrote the foreign policy speech. And here's a little tidbit. In my draft of the speech, I said, I can understand how the Russians feel threatened by us because we've encircled them with NATO countries. And that line in the speech was taken out by Jeff Sessions, who substituted the following: they say that we can't trust the Russians. I intend to find out. That was a wise change. But if there was a pro-Russian person there, it was moi. Okay, it was me. I was the pro-Russian guy. I thought, and by the way, still think, that the answer to the problems is try to cut a deal with the bad guy, that is Putin. Even now, we're sending tons of money to the Ukraine to fight a proxy war which gets Ukrainians killed, but no Americans killed. I think what you want to do is what Kissinger suggested and what the Pope suggested, which is get on the blower and say, look, Putin, stop it. There's an opportunity for a mutually advantageous bargain here. But anyway, that's by the by. So I was there, right, at the beginning of the Russian collusion. And no, I didn't see it. And I didn't see Jeff Sessions being tampered with in any particular way. I mean, he was seated one seat ahead of me at the speech, right? And he did a handshake with the Russian ambassador, which was bupkis. Okay.
Even though it is by the by,
yeah.
Since you brought it up, in your vision of a progressive, conservative America, Because as you said, there are no American boots on the ground in Ukraine. There never will be. Does your idea ever contemplate moving away from, one of the better term, an isolationist policy, where we would actually have American troops on the ground anywhere?
Oh, yeah, I can see that. Remember where I'm coming from, right?
Okay.
Which is Canada. So one progressive conservative I do like was Franklin Roosevelt, whom I would have voted for in 32 and certainly 40, 44. American isolationism at that point was, I think, a very bad thing. I think it was very necessary for America to come in and take on Germany, which, by the way, we didn't declare war on Germany so much as they declared war on us. We were brought in involuntarily on that one. But I think it was important for America to stand up at that point for an international system of the rule of law, of human decency. One thing I did like about Trump was a repudiation of the George W. Bush agenda of exporting democracy. I mean, that was not good.
No.
We don't do imperialism really well, right? So
that wasn't George Bush. That was Dick Cheney.
Well, it was Dick Cheney. It was a number of people. I mean, it was Don Rumsfeld. Right?
Yeah.
For older listeners, I described Don Rumsfeld and Lee Atwater of the Southern Strategy and David Koch as the Altamont Rock Concert of conservatism. Just the worst thing in the world.
We are really contemporaries.
Yeah.
Well, kids who listen to this are having no idea.
I know. We just lost your audience. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have done it.
You want to keep your audience.
Yeah.
I don't really have that much character for that. Well, going back to your book, a lot of, obviously declaring war is within the purview of the president and Congress. But in the Federalist Papers, and those who didn't trust a government that ruled over states, which was a republic, which gave rise to what you're talking about, do you believe, well, Roe versus Wade is a perfect example. The concept is that overturning it was to allow the states to resume having the rights that they would have had under the Constitution based on certain framers of the Constitution and writers in the Federalist Papers.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think?
Well, I teach a course on the framers at Scalia. We work our way through Madison's notes. I'm a great fan of the framers. I'm not a great fan of Madison, little Jemmy Madison, the hypochondriac who outlived them all, and the Federalist Papers, which interjected a note of cynicism into American politics, which worked itself out into pluralism. And I'm not a fan of that. I'm not quite sure what your question was, however.
No pun intended, but who trumps, the states or the federal government?
Both. I mean, to be a federalist should mean that you think there is a role for the federal government. And I think there is a role for the federal government on a whole bunch of things, including national welfare and Medicare, for example. So I have no problems with that. But in other respects, what we're talking about is, when we talk about the Supreme Court, is not the feds versus the states so much as, the unelected judges deciding for all of us. If their decisions have the effect of returning power to the states and away from the Supreme Court, that may be a good thing, right? It may not be a good thing, but in terms of abortion, I think it was a good thing.
Well, going back to the book then, and discussing all these things that are pieces of a puzzle, and again, mixing metaphors, I understand, I believe what your roadmap is, but explain to those who haven't yet read the book, this concept of a roadmap towards what you believe will be the end game, where progressive Republicans do, in fact, not rule the nation, but become the party that champions the country.
What is the roadmap for a political party that wants to recall the nobility of America?
Yeah.
And that remembers that we've done great things and we're a wonderful country and we're still the destination for every immigrant in the world who wants to move from his country. What we want to do, I'm not an ideologue. Ideologies are mental shortcuts that shut down facts. We also always should be on the side of being on the side of the facts. I think that's going to mean we're not going to start with a bias in favor of the states or in terms of the feds. There are certain things the feds should be doing in terms of guaranteeing national civil rights and national welfare. And there are things where the devolution down to the states makes a lot of sense because people can sort themselves out that way. And also because the competition, the laboratory of the states, will help tell us what's the best rule overall. So, those are good things. The states' rights types who would have everything devolved down to the state level, that I'm totally opposed to. So I'd like a mixture of federal powers and state powers, but I don't have an ideology that gets me there.
Well, how do we get there then?
We try to see what works, right? So we're embarked on an experiment right now, for example, about abortion. And, my prediction is that this is going to be much less of an issue than people think. That I think in the end, we'll all realize there are morally serious problems here, and the people at the extremes are not going to be winning this one. We're not going to have an absolute ban or, absolute rights to abortion and late-term abortions and all of that. We'll be somewhere in the middle, which is where politics always tends to bring you, unless the Supreme Court or something like that gets in. Now, I'd like to see an end to the cultural wars which Roe v. Wade helped start. I mean, the idea that if you get the Supreme Court right, it'll take care of everything is wrong. I'd like to see more done in terms of politics and less done in terms of law.
Well, you use the term experiment as it was going to come out of my mouth, but the American experiment was made it was ab initio, it was made out of whole cloth. This experiment that you posit is one that will be occurring while other people, it's like John Lennon said, life is what happens when you're busy doing other things. And this experiment that you're suggesting is in a laboratory of sorts while other people are suffering, are wondering what's going on, don't have enough money. So your experiment is going to be coexisting with America as it exists on a day-to-day basis. And that's, I guess, would be a critique in the QUE sense of the book. How do you conduct this experiment while we keep the country running? I think that's the biggest problem.
Well, I think it'll be less drastic than that, because I think the politicians at the state level are not going to be loonies. I think there'll be people who'll make exceptions in the right kinds of cases. I don't know what the answer is, however. I think in general that when you make a radical change, which is what the abortion decision did, it'll take a while for you to find out just exactly how it's going to play itself out. But I'm more optimistic in general about politics solving problems. I'm very much a Democrat about these things. I have a great deal of confidence in Americans to work things out in a way that works, right? And I have less confidence in academics and judges to get things right by virtue of some a priori scheme of what the right result is.
Yeah, so, but all of your books come from the viewpoint of an academic, but you're also trying to not teach us a lesson, but give us some ideas about what might work. Would that be a summary of what your book actually? It's not telling us what to do, not telling us what's going to happen, but suggesting this might be an approach that would yield good results.
Yeah, ultimately what I'm saying is we've been too fixated on getting the right result, however we get there. Less concerned about how to get there. I think we should be more concerned about the mechanics of getting to the right place, because a priori ideas are often wrong. The great problem I have with the American presidential system is it lacks a reverse gear. as opposed to a parliamentary system. So what happens there is things are easily passed and easily mended. And here we have things that are hard to pass, but once they're passed, it's the law of the Medes and the Persians. So you're stuck with bad laws. Laws that are discovered to be bad with the experience of use, or laws which turn out to be bad because history has moved on, but we're still stuck with those things. And so in the end, when I preferred a parliamentary system, it's because I see myself as more democratic than Americans.
Yeah.
Or than the American system.
We need question hour twice a week.
Yeah, we really do. And you know, yeah, which you have to do with intelligence and knowledge and wit, and in Canada in 2 languages.
Trump doesn't know what question hour is.
No, he wouldn't do well. I don't know who would do. It's an interesting question. Who would be a great American parliamentarian? You know, like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, for example. Bill Clinton would have been fine. Obama would have been fine.
Which goes back to the concept of laughter that you raise in your book. That's what allows it. Kennedy too.
Yeah, Kennedy for sure. You know, I'll tell you a little story. Early on, I was asked to write the Trump inaugural speech.
Oh, geez.
And yeah, okay. So I did. And what I did is I bought a book of inaugural speeches. And as I read them, I realized, holy shoot, this is a really big deal. All right, an inauguration speech. So I produced a Kennedy-esque speech because, you know, hey, I'm a boomer and I go back to that period. And I thought a healing speech like that after the campaign in 2016 would be a good thing. And I heard the speeches delivered. In fact, I was in the Canadian Embassy when I heard it. And I realized it wasn't written by me. It was written by Steve Bannon, and it was horrible. And I realized at that point, this is not turning out well.
Hey, totally irrelevant. Where were you when Kennedy was assassinated, and how was it perceived in Canada different than it was in the United States?
In Western Canada, we did not clearly understand that there was a big difference between the border of Saskatchewan and Manitoba and the border of Saskatchewan and North Dakota. Like, you know, it was like one common country. I was in boarding school. You know, I was in the Jesuit boarding school. So.
Okay, last question. What is the collected volumes behind you to your right that you have in your library?
Gee, I don't know. Oh, that's probably the great books, you know. This is my wife's library, so you know, she gets to decide. I have no choice.
How does that work, you and she writing together?
It's really very simple. I don't, you know, you're married, I assume. It's just I do exactly what she tells me. I'm no fool. I'm not an idiot.
I think, well, that's progressive. That's a progressive.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
And that's a good explanation of what progressive might mean, is that you take a course that's, as Jeremy Bentham might say, utilitarian, modified by John Stuart Mill.
Yeah, that works for me.
Utilitarianism. Good point.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This is excellent. And as I told you, I own a bookstore. I'm not going to have a book by Bill O'Reilly in there. I'm not going to have a book by Tucker Carlson, but I will have your new book and your old books as well.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. It was fun.
It was a pleasure. Yeah, I agree.
Did I change anything in your belief system?
I think we agree on more than we disagree, which is great. No, I hate Trump so much that I would vote for a chimpanzee before I would vote for him.
Another question, you asked me about the books. Who is that gentleman behind you?
Oh, Stan. That's Stan.
Okay. I want to ask. I don't want to know.
Don't ask, don't tell.
Don't tell. Exactly. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good talking.
Sure. Bye-bye.
Bye.